Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa. Recently, I made a video about the making of a smocked bishop dress. And I talked about some of the difficulties of pleating this type of dress for smocking. From what I understand, the typical method is to go ahead and assemble the dress at the shoulder seams and then run the entire thing through a pleater, being careful as you go over those seams. I've never actually done this method because when I was first learning to smock, I watched a YouTube video by Sarah Classic Sewing, and she said that this method could be difficult and often resulted in broken needles due to trying to go through those seams. And she showed an alternate method, which I used in my previous video. I'll link her video below if you're curious. It's a good method, but it does require a lot of threading and unthreading of the pleater needles, and that gets a bit tedious. So I have found another method that I think is easier because it doesn't require any pleating through the seams or unthreading and rethreading the pleater. So you want to start out by cutting out all of your pieces for the pattern, or at least all of the pieces that will be pleated. I am using the Children's Corner Bishop pattern, but for the most part, most patterns should have pretty similar pieces, and that would be the 2 sleeve pieces, 2 pieces for the back, and 1 piece for the front. And then you want to go ahead and thread your smocking pleater with the number of rows that you need. In my case, I need 7. And to pleat these, you're just going to run all of the pieces through the pleater. I suppose you could technically do this in any order you want, but I always like to do it in the same order that everything's going to be sewn together in. So I start with a back piece, going through at the center back seam, and then move on to a sleeve piece, the front piece, then other sleeve, and then the back piece again, or the final back piece. And as you're doing this, you want to keep in mind which side of your fabric is up. So you either want all of the pieces to be facing up or facing down. Now technically there is a right and a wrong way to put your pieces through your pleater, but I think it depends on the type of pleater you have, whether you're supposed to put it in with the pattern up or down. Personally, I don't actually know which way mine is supposed to go, and therefore I usually don't worry about it too much as long as I'm consistent. So again, either all the pattern pieces go through with the print up or down. And once a piece is on here, I'm just going to pull it off of the needles, but not off of the pleater altogether. So I pull it down to the bottom and move on to the next sleeve. Now I'm using a solid here, so what I've done to mark for my right side of the fabric is I just put a pin in each piece, and that side is supposed to be theoretically the right side of the fabric. And so I'm just going to continue pleating all of these pieces, not taking anything off completely and not unthreading any needles. And as you go, you want to kind of pull the thread up and out as you push pieces further down onto the thread. Okay, so all of the pieces have gone through the pleater, and I'm now just taking the last piece off of the needles. Keep pushing all the other pieces further onto the threads. Once the last piece comes off, you just pull all of those threads till they come off the needles. Push this back a bit. Now at this point, everything is still attached here at the bobbins. So what I want to do is take my pieces, and starting with this piece, which is the back piece, I'm looking at it right now with the wrong side up. Okay, so I've got the wrong side up, and what I want to do is pull out some of these pleating threads, or actually all of the pleating threads, up to or past the seam allowance. Or in the case of this piece here, this is the back piece, this placket here. So this entire piece up to that point needs to be flat. So I want to pull out all of the pleating threads, to that point. So just like this. There we go. So they're all pulled out. And now what I'm going to do is tie these off in groups of 3 and 4. So I gather up 3 or 4 threads and then just tie them all together in a knot. Once those knots are tied, I'm going to push the piece towards the knots so that the knots sit flush on the fabric. And then I'm going to come down here. I'm going to keep pushing those other pieces further down onto the threads. I'm going to look at my panel, and I don't necessarily need it to lay completely flat, but I don't want it like really densely pleated because I need enough thread to be able to block everything later. So this is a pretty good amount. And I'm going to cut the back piece off from the rest. So when you cut these pieces apart, make sure that there's a good amount of thread here and a good amount of thread here that's past where the pieces are, because you don't want those pleating threads to start pulling out farther than you want it to. You're going to pull them out, but you don't want them to pull out on their own. So back here with this back piece again, I still have the wrong side facing up, and I am going to pull out some of these, the ends of these pleating threads again, this time far enough back that it will be inside the seam allowance. So the seam allowance of this pattern is 1/4 inch, so that means that I need to pull these threads out to the nearest one, the one nearest to 1/4 inch, or 1/4 inch or a little more. You don't want less, or these threads will get sewn over later, and then you won't be able to adjust your pleats. So once all of those are pulled out, just tie a knot at this end, just like you did at the other end. So that's how you do the back piece. Again, this side here is pulled out to the seam allowance. This side here is pulled out to the placket. Now we can just move on to another piece. This is a sleeve. So with this one, both sides are going to be pulled out to the amount of the seam allowance and tied off. Notice when I do this that once I pick a row, I go and pull out the pleats on that row regardless of how far in it might be. Like for example, on this one here, it's 1/4 inch up here and it's a lot more than 1/4 inch down there, but I go all the way down keeping it in the same row. So in every spot there's at least 1/4 inch pulled out of the pleats. Okay, so I have all of the pieces off of the pleater and tied off. And you can see that basically the pleating threads do not go into the seam allowance, and that was the goal in the previous step if I somehow missed saying that. So now at this point it's time to connect all of these pieces, and this would be done just like you would any other time you're assembling a bishop. So you're going to sew the sleeve pieces to the front and back pieces along these seams, and the only thing you have to pay attention to really is that whatever seam you're sewing at the time, you want to make sure that the knots here are pulled tight up against the fabric and they're not like hanging loose like this, because if it's like this, it's much more likely that the thread is going to get caught in your seam, and again, then you won't be able to adjust your pleats. So just go ahead, pull the knots nice and tight on whatever seam you're sewing first. I find it best to sew basically one seam at a time, and you're sewing these seams just like you normally would, right sides together and with the typical seam allowance of your pattern. So the dress is all sewn together along the shoulder or sleeve seams, and I'm over at my ironing board with my smocking block guide. I bought this separate from my pattern because my pattern did not come with one. So it has these circles that represent the different sizes of a bishop and like how large the neckline should be, and then these lines that show where each seam should be. So I'm taking the dress and flipping it so that the long sides are facing up so that I can see these knots where my threads are, my pleating threads are. And I'm starting by lining up the top with the appropriate neckline or circle, and then the back with the appropriate line. And I'm pinning the back in place and coming to this back seam and pinning it to the back seam line on here. Once I have it pinned in place for this section, I just go ahead and find one of the pleating thread knots that will run and just pull it to the appropriate tightness. And once it's pulled properly on like the tightness, how tight it is, then I will just tie it off, trim off these excess threads, and even out the pleats. And I do this for every section. And if you find that one end doesn't pull as well, you can always try the other end. Typically one or the other will stay, fairly loose enough to do it. After all the seams are tied off and the pleats are evened out, I ran some steam over it. And now it's time to smock. This is basically done just like you normally would. The only difference is that as you come to the seams, there might be a gap in the pleating, and you can just smock right over it. So go from the last pleat on one side of the seam and straight to the first pleat on the other side of the seam. And then when you do that stitch, pull it tight so that the gap disappears. And don't worry, this won't affect the fit. After the smocking is done, steam it again and let it sit for a while to cool. And then it's time to remove the pleating threads. The reason I said to tie the knots on the wrong sides of the fabric is to make this step easier. I've tied those knots on the right sides before, and it's harder to find them because you smock over them. So in this case, you can just clip those knots and pull them out like you normally would. And at this point, you continue assembling as you typically would. For me, that means adding the sleeve and neck bands, sewing the side and back seams, turning under and whip stitching the hem, cuffs, and facings, and attaching the buttons and buttonhole loops. And if you want to see this in slightly more detail, you can check out my previous video. And that is what I consider the easiest way to pleat a bishop dress. I hope this was clear. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.